Merci, je m'appelle Troy Davis, je suis, malgré mon nom anglais, anglophone, je suis strasbourgeois, pur porc, né ici, mais je vais parler en anglais, voilà, puisqu'on m'a demandé qu'il y ait au moins une intervention en anglais. Alors, je ne vais pas vous parler d'énergie démocratique, je vais vous parler d'autre chose, de comment faire la paix mondiale. Voilà, alors, how to create world peace in our times. This is a very big topic, very ambitious topic, and one of the reasons is that when people think of world peace, they think of nearly religious images. They think of an ideal world, they think everybody loves each other, and where you have social progress, environmental progress today, and it sounds so difficult that world peace is not taken as something practical. In fact, world peace is an age-old dream. People think about world peace all the time, but it's also the butt of jokes. You know, when you have Miss World and Miss Universe on stage, and the organizers ask, so what is your biggest dream? World peace. You know, it's kind of a joke. But unfortunately, it's too bad that it's a joke, because I say that we should redefine our expectations, we should lower the expectations, and we should really think about how to do world peace, but not in the way, in this idealistic fantasy world of world peace. So, how do we do this? Well, another thing about world peace is that, ironically, it has been the goal of nearly all conquerors and of all empires, from the Egyptians and the Syrians to Charlemagne to the Romans. Nobody ever said, well, we're going to conquer people to go to war. They'll say, we'll conquer people and the world to have peace. Of course, it will be peace under my rule. I will be the king, and I will rule, and there will be peace. Even Hitler said the Third Reich, the goal was to create world peace, not at all war. War was just a little detail on the way. And that's the problem, that you use the most idealistic notion, the most wonderful notion, but to do the most horrible things. So we really have a problem here. Now, let's redefine world peace in a more modest way. As I said before, we have this very harmful notion of world peace as, in a sense, paradise on earth. Well, as a political scientist and as a physicist, I do not believe in idealism. Idealism in politics doesn't exist. Idealism, in fact, kills people in politics. So let's redefine it. And of course, I know that you need to have social progress, amount of progress, but I say that peace in a very defined, modest way is the first necessary step. And how do I define it? Simply as the absence of war, in a sense, military war. Now, you might say this is not enough. I know it's not enough, but this would be already a huge and worthy goal. Think of what's happening in Syria today. People might say, oh, we have economic war between China and Europe and the US. I'm sure that the Syrians will be ecstatic to have economic war with their neighbor and not real military war. So when people answer you, oh, but there is more than just military war, then say, well, okay, let's get rid of the military war first, and then we can talk about the other goals. Because, to recap, other human progress depends on the absence of war. We've seen this in the prosperity. Europe is the most socially progressive continent or area in the world and in history. Why? Because we got rid of war. Inside the European Union, at least. So how do we make peace traditionally? There are two main paradigms, two main ways to make peace. One is civis pacem para bellum. Publius Flavius, 4th century Roman adage, peace through strength. If you want peace, prepare for war. That is the most traditional. It sounds paradoxical. You can give good arguments for it. But this is the most traditional way, which is still used today, by the way. This is not things which is, just antiquity. It's still used today. The second one is love your neighbor. Most religions, love your neighbor, love. Individual morality. Peace will happen through love. Well, I can give you many theoretical reasons why this doesn't work. But you just have to look at history for pragmatic reasons. For instance, we did create peace in Europe after 1945. In fact, the first step was reconciliation in France and Germany. Now, you can imagine that there was no love between French and Germans in 1945. In spite of that, we created peace. So anybody who tells you, to have peace we need love, give them that counterexample. So neither work well, but there's one way that works. I will not give the theoretical justification, but just pragmatically, we know. It's political engineering, what I call political engineering. People might call it something else, but I call it engineering. In other words, before, remember, you had in the love paradigm, you were trying to put individual morality in the center. But this is very dangerous. If you put individual morality in the center of politics, this is very dangerous. That means the state cares about your individual morality. That means you don't have freedom anymore. What we should do is not have individual morality in the politics, but political morality. When I say morality, I don't mean that a politician is not supposed to cheat or be corrupt. Of course, well, not to be corrupt at least, but it's not his personal morality of the politician. I'm talking about the infrastructure of politics itself should be based on ethical principles. And we will see two of those principles later. I'll give you two historical examples of this political engineering. In fact, maybe those are the only two examples that we really know in the world that have been very successful. People are not used to thinking of them as examples, but that's what they are. They're examples of political engineering. The United States of America, which was, by the way, created in 1789. Nearly nobody knows that fact. Everybody thinks it's 1776. Even Americans think that. It's 1789. And Europe. Now, notice I don't say the European Union, because Europe is not a country. So I mean, in general, the process of European construction, including European Union and Council of Europe. Most people forget the Council of Europe, but this is very important. One very important thing is that people have forgotten the goal of European construction. I claim the goal is world peace. How can I make that claim? Well, in fact, it's very simple. Robert Schuman tells us this. In his own speech of May 9th, 1950, he tells us that the goal of European construction is world peace. Most people forget also that the founding fathers of Europe had not just gone out of one war. They had experienced the First World War as teenagers. So they had experienced 2 world wars in their lifetime. This is very important to understand the psychology and the motivation, the psychological motivation for those people to create peace, in spite of the fact that there was still so much hatred, in spite of that fact. And the proof is here, a facsimile of the Schuman Plan. The first words of the talk by Schuman is La paix mondiale, world peace. Because they knew very well that if Europe is part of the entire world, which we seem to have forgotten today, today is as if we're just looking at our navel and trying to build our little Europe. Okay, it's slowly expanding, okay, fine. But we forget that the ultimate goal was world peace, and it was to be a 3-step process. First, peace between France and Germany. Then you expand it slowly to include all Europe. And then, they didn't know how, but somehow, ultimately, the real goal is world peace. They didn't have a specific plan or method, at least for world peace. But at least this gave a plan for European peace. But notice, it's not written European peace, it's world peace. So the founders of both political entities, the United States of America and Europe as a generic concept, were the first true, what I call political engineers. They set out to consciously build political structures, not by chance, not haphazardly. They set out to think. In fact, if you read the Federalist Papers, this is a wonderful, it's like an instruction manual it's like a bunch of engineers coming together and say, okay, how are we going to build this building? And they argue about this and that, but if you build it this way, this is going to happen, and so forth. It's wonderful. Most people, even in the US, do not see and read it, and it's not taught like that, but this is what it is. And they use many terms that have this idea of building and of constructing and so forth. But they were political geniuses, but there was a problem. In fact, they're amateurs, because there was no theory of political engineering. So they operated by the seat of their pants. I interviewed once Georges Berthoin, who was the former chief of staff of Jean Monnet. And they were, I mean, people think now it was the European construction was very, series of linear events and everything very logical. But no, there were crises all the time. They were trying to cope with crisis all the time. And there was not a sort of big master plan like an architect would have to build a building. There wasn't. There were general ideas and general thoughts how to do them, but there wasn't. So there are two weaknesses. Weaknesses in both cases were the same. It's very interesting. 200 years apart, 150 years apart, both the same weaknesses. There was not enough application of the democratic principle. Very important. I think you can see that. And secondly, there was no shared identity, no shared narrative in both cases. What was the consequence? The consequence is that after 70 years after the US was created, you had a civil war, the most destructive, the most deadly war in the history of the United States, tearing the United States apart. And about 60 years after that famous speech by Schuman, you have the Euro crisis. Very interesting to see about the same time frame, even though there's such a big difference in over 100 years in difference. So what we need is not just a theory of political engineering, but of democracy engineering, so that we do things in a democratic way. And also, we need a shared story. We need an identity. And how do we do this? Well, the way it's been done throughout the ages, in always the same way, through a shared identity myth or creation myth. If you study the origin of politics, every human group has always created their identity through some kind of creation myth. It's always like that. So what are the lessons for the world at large of those two historical examples? Well, first of all, the global political architecture must be re-engineered or re-architected. But it must be done in a more democratic way than we engineered or architected the US and Europe. Otherwise, we'll have the same problem, we'll repeat the same problems. And secondly, we need to create together a global creation myth so that we are identified as human beings, not as members of a particular tribe, a sub-tribe of the human species. And so that we see ourselves as citizens of the world, not just of one little subunit. Now, what are the dangers? By definition, the global political architecture will be supranational. Okay, this is quite obvious. But it could be democratic or autocratic. Democracy is very, very hard work. You have to fight for it all the time. If you don't, it's like in the Alice in Wonderland, the Red Queen, who keeps on running all the time. And Alice said, well, why are you running? Well, because if we don't run, you'll never keep in place. You have to keep in place, you have to keep on running. Democracy is the same way. You can never stop. And if you stop, you will slip into autocracy. So the most likely outcome today, because we're not building consciously a global democracy, is actually slipping into a world autocracy. And this is, by the way, what people who believe in conspiracies keep on talking about. Oh, a new world order, which will be global dictatorship. On the face of what's happening, this is what we're slipping into. So we must fight for world peace, but under freedom. Because it's very easy to have world peace under dictatorship. This is what we had throughout history. Every empire said, I will be the king, I will conquer you, and then there'll be peace. But we do not want a world empire under a world king or a world emperor, and then it will be world peace under a dictatorship. That would be the worst possible scenario, especially given modern technologies, which could have an absolute totalitarian state. Then this will be a nightmare. In fact, you see this in science fiction movies all the time. Because otherwise, the world peace will be used as an excuse to create global dictatorship, which has been all the time. So how do we prevent that? How do we prevent global dictatorship? Well, we had to invent institutions and this global identity myth with some basic principles, which is what I mentioned before. And I suggest two basic principles, which I didn't invent. Those principles come from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, come from the Declaration of Independence, come from Déclaration des droits de l'homme et des citoyens, and so forth. Those are fundamental political principles which everybody pays lip service to, but in reality, they're not applied as fundamental laws to build political structure. Human dignity, the equality of human dignity for everybody. Everybody has equal human dignity, and that the sovereignty belongs to the people. Political sovereignty belongs to people, not to the king. In other words, in the old days, the sovereignty came from the sky, from somewhere up there, and usually the king said, I am the representative of God, From the beginning of history, that's how kings have justified their power, from China to Japan to Sumer to the Aztecs, so forth, so on. They represent the gods, the pharaohs. But I say no, the sovereignty comes from the bottom, from the people. So it's a completely opposite. It's the reverse of what has been happening for thousands of years. So to be at peace and free, we need justice. And to have justice, that's why we need those global institutions that are democratic, that protect human rights. Otherwise, you'll have rebellions. If the Roman Empire had been more democratic, it might have survived up to today. Example, the European Union is at peace today and freer than it's ever been because it has those kinds of institutions. It has a parliament, and it protects human rights, even though the protects human rights is actually delegated mostly to the court here, which is a court of the Council of Europe. But still, it applies for the European Union. Now, this brings us to Strasbourg. Strasbourg has a huge role to play in world history, which nobody realizes. I say that in 5,000 years, in 10,000 years, people will remember Strasbourg, like we know Babylon now. Now we know one of the big cities in human history. How is this possible? Well, let's assume we have world peace on the freedom. The human race still exists, and we haven't been enslaved, and so forth. What will children in history class learn about the evolution of the world in history? How will they learn that they know that there was war once upon a time? What will they learn? How did the war disappear? How did we get to world peace with freedom? They will learn, well, history started in Sumer 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years from now. But 5,000 years later, which means right now, in Strasbourg were born the first institutions which were the precursor of the institutions that you need to create world peace. The DNA of the future global political architecture, which is needed for world peace, is represented here in those institutions. Those are the first political animals that were created. It's like a new species of animal that we created. And from this species animal will descend all the other animals which will help, who are necessary to create world peace. Because Strasbourg is the seat of the first ever supranational institutions in human history. It has never existed in the history of humanity. The European Parliament and the European Court of Human Rights. So, what is the... Now, of course, this is a very short talk, so many more things to say, but what is a simple recipe to create world peace? To create world peace, you need to do two things, which are relatively simple, just a matter of a collective will. You don't need billions and trillions of euros or dollars. You need to create global institutions with the DNA that you find here, the Strasbourg DNA, which you could also define as supranational democracy and supranational human rights. But you have to do it in a democratic way and based on what I call the global social contract, which is the globalization of the ideas of Locke, of Hobbes, and of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And secondly, you have to consciously create a shared identity story, a global creation myth, to give birth to humanity as humanity. And this is what human groups have done at every level for millennia, since the beginning of history. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much.